Hello and welcome to the Cubicle Liberation Podcast. I'm here with Joshua Fletcher. How you doing, Fletch?
I am doing great today. Thank you for asking.
Today we are talking about recognizing trends to avoid big mistakes and more accurately identify positive trends. And Fletch pointed out something really interesting about kind of the difference between missing out on a correct trend versus falsely identifying a trend. What do you think? There's some major distinction you had.
Yeah, so this kind of falls into the kind of concept of like avoiding a failure condition, right? Every single day there are millions of opportunities that you didn't catch, right? That you didn't get, that you weren't aware of. You can't be in every, position in the stock market, for instance, on any given day. So there's always stuff going on that you miss. But being wrong about maybe one single thing that you do can completely wipe you out. And so I won't say being more cautious, but realizing that you're always going to be missing things. You're always going to be missing opportunities. Like you brought up the concept of fear of missing out, right? The FOMO thing. This is really big. We wind up kind of chasing things, and chasing things is kind of the wrong behavior, so to speak, if you want to really put yourself in a position to win with trends. And so what we really want to do is kind of not even expose this, talk about it, shine some light on specific areas that we can actually know, right? And build on what we can know versus, it looks like a bunch of people over here are making money. Let me jump over there and see if I can make some money
before it's too late.
Before it's too late. Right.
And I think that what we're going to give you in this podcast is some tools and some ideas and some thinking and some examples of how to correctly identify the trends so that you just need to take a step back and do your homework. Warren Buffett actually has something on this where or I can't remember if it's Warren Buffett or Benjamin Graham or both, where if he doesn't understand the opportunity, it doesn't matter if it's the best opportunity ever, he passes.
I love that.
To take the time to do the work and to really look at it. And if somebody's like, well, if you don't invest now, then you're going to miss it. And he's like, all right, cool. There's going to be another train that comes along the next day.
Well, see, that's the big thing, like being a digital marketer, like you understand that, right? You get to the point of like scarcity, right? And that's a part of a lot of people's sales and conversion. I'm not saying it's wrong or right or whatever, but that's the point where it's like, oh, this is being taken away from me. I want it more now, right? Whether you understand it or not, it kind of feels natural to move toward it, to go after it a little bit more.
Yeah.
And that's what this man pointed out. He's like, if I don't understand it, I'm just going to let it go. It's not, there's another, bus coming along pretty soon.
Yep.
And I can always catch that one. So,
right.
Are we, David, I just want to make sure that, are we sharing the screen? Yeah, we're recording. We're sharing the screen. Oops. I don't know if you intend to share the notes or not.
I did not.
There's not a problem with it, but I was just checking. Cool.
That's a good point. And we are recording. We did actually shoot this before and we were not recording. So some topics that we will cover today, like COVID, business opportunities, trends, stock market trends. Fletch actually studied economics in grad school. He's going to talk about that a little bit. Let us know, give us some context to his background. Not in a braggy way, but in a way that helps you understand that like he's not talking out of his ass in some of these cases. He actually has some
rarely.
Well, when he does, it's beautiful. I'm also going to talk about like false straight lines, going to my kind of spiel on that, which is I think a really important way of understanding because trends are inherently based on numbers, and so when you identify kind of what they look like, that's kind of important. A short-term trend versus long-term trends, and we're going to start actually with what is a trend. So what actually is a trend? You kind of have to define it first because I think it's not like super clear right out of the gate what really constitutes a trend. Fletch, what are your thoughts on that?
I get to jump in on this one, huh?
Yeah,
well, so okay, so this is talking a little bit from a background in economics and understanding kind of how a lot of these are portrayed, especially in kind of popular media, mainstream media. Trends inherently are based on history. They're looking at the data that has accumulated over now. And, if we look at the COVID's one, we could look at the stock market and what it's done. It's looking backwards at where we've been at each incremental point and then that what that does is usually form some kind of a slope or a curve. And then what our mind does is it continues that trajectory, right, so to speak. And so, you know, in concept, at least, a lot of us are familiar with the way it's reported, with the way it's talked about, with the way it appears to be. What I'd like to do is maybe help look at this a little bit differently, in that a trend is a trend. It's a fact, right? In that it is historical data. Those data points, as long as they are accurate, then the trend is accurate. But that doesn't necessarily say that the future is going to continue along that trajectory. The future is based on, you know, now, right? From moment to moment, things are related. But all too often what happens, just because the mind works the way it works, you know, it's like, well, if a bunny rabbit's running this way, it's going to continue to run this way unless it changes direction, right? And if you're a predator, which you can argue we are as humans or not, our minds are just set up to say, it's going this way, it's going to continue to go this way, right? And that's why prey tends to move back and forth, right? And so our brains are just set up to assume that. And so if you start to look at any kind of data that's called a trend by an economist, it's going to look exclusively at the past, and it's probably going to talk about projections for the future, which are all but random guesses.
Yeah, and I would add in what I mentioned before about a trend is inherently numerical. There's numbers, even fashion trends. It's a new numbers thing. More people are wearing a certain thing or whatever. And this is actually an important thing to consider because especially, I mean, and it's really obvious in some circumstances and less obvious in others, like with the stock market, it's super obvious. Obviously, there's a number. But understanding kind of how numbers work and what they really mean, because some data is not in a bubble. When you look at data, a lot of times you have to look at, well, like how exactly was that data collected, and that can dramatically affect kind of the results of the data.
Yeah.
So looking at it, the numbers, I like how you put, like, it's basically taking where we are right now, looking back and trying to project forward. That's essentially what a trend is if you're trying to look at it. So Fletch, what would you say, like, what's at a really high level, what's a correct way to start identifying or understanding a trend or a lack thereof?
Well, so one of the things that I consider are exactly what you talked about just now, which are these contextual factors. They look like they're the context, which is just like, well, so how is, you know, like one of those factors is what's driving this, right? And, you know, economically speaking, a lot of times that's looking at, you know, financial situations, like money situations. And it kind of descends a little bit into supply and demand. It can very quickly, very easily, right? We can kind of look at it within that frame. And so if we realize that there is an artificially like dictated or determined supply, this is what like cartels tend to do, right? Where they say, we're only going to produce this much, so to speak, right? We kind of got into Bitcoin a little bit. That might be kind of a factor. Oil, OPEC, right? The oil producing economic corporation or cartel countries.
Yeah, I don't know.
But it's kind of that thing, right?
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons why we have antitrust legislation, monopolies, right? The whole game monopoly. It's like if you control supply, then you control price.
Yeah.
And if the demand is ever increasing, then you can start to understand that there's going to be a trend because something is driving that.
Yeah.
And as much as anything, that's what I'd like people to look more closely at, which is what's driving this historical, you know, change in price or supply or whatever it might be.
And yeah, like understanding what's driving us. That's usually what is driving a trend in human beings, the psychology of it. And really, like, if there's one like main point on how to identify a trend or lack thereof, it would be looking at the many contextual factors. Really trying to, as Fletch said, just kind of dig deep and look at what's going on there and understand. You're going to understand your way to victory here or to avoiding a big loss.
Well, one of the people you talk a lot about Buffett, right? Is partner Munger, who are value investors, right? they're not trying to go chase every stock that looks like is going up, right? They dig deep and they get right when they get right. It takes as long as it takes for them to make a move into a new position, so to speak. But they really look at what is going to affect the actual value, long-term value of the security they get.
It's kind of a funny thing. And who I mentioned before, Benjamin Graham wrote a book called The Intelligent Investor, which Benjamin Graham was Warren Buffett's mentor a long time ago. And it's a great book. This leads us into our next topic, which is the stock market, which is one of the main places where people try to identify trends and stuff like that. I remember, I have this memory that after reading The Intelligent Investor, it kind of blew my mind that it was still, this is like an idea that people have. I was talking to somebody about a stock at like an Apple store, some Apple worker. I don't remember what the context was, but he was like, well, if you want to know whether the stock is good, look at the graph on what it has done lately and whether or not it will go up. And it's just sort of like, not exactly correct. Not correct at all. Especially when it comes to stocks. You bring up Warren Buffett. I like their methods a lot. They do try to look at like, okay, is there really value here? And if there's not value there and the stock is going up, they're not going to buy it. And it's also more about like, is this a good price? You want to actually buy it when it's low. So is it actually a good price for the value that you?
Well, there's no way to know it's low if you don't understand the underlying value or what's going to drive that value, right? Yeah. If you're just going off of other people's assessment of what they'll pay for it, you might not be getting a deal even if things look like they're going up.
But I do think that there is a definite long-term stock market trend of up overall. And the reason for that, I would say, is when you look at the context, why is that the case? Is it eventually going to go back down to where it was 100 years ago and stay there? I would say no, because basically the stock market encapsulates all the additional value that we have developed as a society over the years. So when we make a new invention that makes our lives easier or makes us more productive, like email, which you can maybe say it makes you less or more productive, or the internet or cars or TV or whatever, that is encapsulated in the stock market. So there is actual value there. So to me, as long as society doesn't as long as there's not like an Armageddon type event, the stock market will continue to go up. Yes, there will be fluctuations. That's natural, especially right now with the COVID thing. There's a really good chance that it's going to, we're going to be hurt a lot by that. But long term, you look at it 20 years from now, still will have gone up significantly in my estimation, just because we're continuing to develop, continuing to make money. We're continuing to add new things to that weren't there before, stuff like that.
Well, and this is a question that a lot of people should ask. And I know it affects people because you open your bank account, right? Or your 401k, and there might be a smaller number there, right? But where did it go, right? Is there inherently less stuff that's useful on the planet now than there was a couple months ago, or going back to like 2018 when, the market went down a lot? Like there's just not inherently less stuff, right? Your currency may have changed considerably, but or that number may have changed, but inherently there's an ever increasing amount of stuff. And if stuff has any value, then overall that number was like growing GDP, like these are things that for like currency reasons, politicians especially and governments need to pay attention to.
Right.
But in a more, I say a more rational sense, in a more foundational sense, there's not less stuff, even if the economy goes down, even if the economy shrinks, even if there's hyperinflation, there's not less stuff. There's not less value in the world. Right. And so it becomes relative in one way of looking at it.
I mean, it's a purely psychological affect the value of,
but it is very psychological, and that triggers all sorts of things that we're going to wind up talking about today.
Yeah. And actually this brings us into something I have here, which is like Bitcoin and crypto. And some people think like the idea that something is as valuable as people will pay for it. How much is the Mona Lisa worth? Well, it's worth as much as people will pay for it, right? A fancy piece of art. I do want to talk about Bitcoin. I think that it's an interesting topic. specifically with like cryptocurrency and the blockchain technology that's built upon. So like, why is a Bitcoin valuable? Is it valuable? And I would say, yes, it has value. And because you can buy it right now. I don't know what the, let's see, BTC, what is it? What does it cost? It's $8,800. Okay. For per Bitcoin.
So just under 10K.
Yeah. So does it have value? Absolutely has value because you can buy it and sell it right now.
Well, so maybe break apart a little bit, perceived value versus actual value, right? Because there's kind of some nuances on that. And it's important.
Yeah, that's true. And David Mills mentioned something that is super valuable, which is that like they're kind of valves, right? And I think this is a really good analogy. And if one of them is really high, but the other one is low, basically whichever one's the minimum is going to be the ultimate value.
The limiting factor, so to speak, on that flow.
And actually, I would say that there's a little bit of wiggle room more with actually perceived value, because there's a lot of times where something has a high perceived value, but its actual value is very low, but it still can sell for a very long time for a lot of money. Like a company that has really good marketing, for example, Apple products, in my opinion, they have really good marketing and their perceived value is higher. And I would argue that their actual value is on par with the non-Apple products, but they're able to continually for many years charge a premium. And you can disagree with me on that, but the analogy I still think stands, and there's tons of other products like this. But if your actual value is really high, but your perceived value is super low, then your effective value is actually very low. And I think ultimately, most of the time with something, if the perceived value is super high and the actual value is really low, eventually it catches up. But
so let's give an example of that, right? Let's look at something where there might be a very high perceived value, but a very low actual value. Like look, that maybe tulips fall in this category.
Oh yeah, the tulip bulb bubble from. Yeah. And this, if you want to know more about this, actually, Benjamin Graham covers it in Intelligent Investor, and he goes into detail about it. It was something, wasn't it like the early 1800s?
I believe it was. And it was, it was more than 100 years ago, but there was
more than 100 years ago. Yeah. And I think it was in Europe that it happened.
Yeah, I think it was like Dutch, even like maybe like in that, northern or Central Europe area.
There was tulip bulbs, the value of them skyrocketed, and not just by a little bit, and they went up and up and up, and then it became this thing where people were buying tulip bulbs to sell it. They were buying it for $80 to sell it for $100
for speculation purposes.
Speculation purposes, and what ends up happening is your friend, like a friend, would be like, "Hey, I just made 1,000 easy ones buying and selling these tulip bulbs. You do it too." And eventually it reaches a point where it's like, people are just like, why would I spend $250 on a tulip bulb that is obviously not worth anywhere near that?
Yeah.
Right. So,
and the answer from that person would be, well, because you can sell it for $300
until you can't, until it reaches its peak.
Yeah.
And
so there is a reason, but that reason's not really, it's not really underpinned. It doesn't have a really solid foundation underneath it at that price. So,
yeah. And so what happened is it crashed really fast. And this might sound familiar because this is what happens with stock market. I think another example that was like this was the internet bubble. But with the internet bubble, I think there was real value there. It just, the perceived value went way higher than it needed to at the time. So ultimately the real value, the actual value did kind of catch it up. But the point is that I think that there are two valves. I think that actually the perceived value is the more powerful valve, if you say, and can kind of overload temporarily the actual value. I think there's tons of other products out there that just they sell for much higher than they just sell for a very high value.
And like one of the things, related to that is like if you even listen to I don't listen to news much or financial news but I am aware of the fact that they use a concept called correcting, right? The market's correcting itself. It's like, well, what in the hell is it correcting? Like what is that about? Like what was wrong? Right. And it, in one way of looking at it, what it's correcting is that the actual price is being driven much more by that perceived value than the actual value.
Yeah. That's effectively what they're saying. Or like new information comes out.
Yeah.
So like with the internet thing, there's actual real value there. Okay. And so let's go back to the Bitcoin thing, because I think a lot of people are like, oh, it goes up and it goes down. What is it? You're not really, it's nothing. What are you buying? It's a digital thing. But I would, if you look at like, I think it's like World of Warcraft and stuff like that, people would sell like, I don't know what there's like digital assets on there they would sell for hundreds of dollars.
Oh yeah, like a magic sword or something that would actually, have there was a conversion rate between like a fantasy game currency, like so many coins, like 1 million gold rupees or whatever the currency was in World of Warcraft to US dollar. There was an actual conversion rate. Like it would be the Deutschmarks to dollars or US dollars versus Australian dollars or whatever. There was one from a completely virtual asset, which is a video game, which was like, oh, that's crazy.
But it's not.
Well, it's not though.
Yeah. Because people will pay for it. It has value.
People will pay for it.
So another example was actually when I was younger, I had a Magic Online connection, Magic the Gathering Online, where you actually collect the cards, and they're digital cards. And I sold the collection for like $1,000. And he's like, okay, why would people pay that? Well, because the stuff on there there's a limit to it, and there's a demand for it. So I think it's true with Bitcoin, but I think to me, what I really wanted to ask myself, the first question I'd want to ask myself is like, is there really value there? In terms of, is it just something that has no purpose? And it's just like a tulip bulbs or Beanie Babies, that maybe there is a little bit of value, but is there real significant value? And to answer that question, I really have to go to like, you kind of have to do some research on like the blockchain technology that is behind, which I definitely think that if you say, does blockchain have value? I would say yes. And the reason for that is that it is a unique way of setting up a program or a system or software that has different properties than typically we would have had in the past. And you can look this up. I'm not going to be able to explain this perfectly. I won't claim to understand all that there is about blockchain, but basically the immediate obvious use for blockchain is for money, because what it does is basically what Bitcoin has is a public ledger, like that is on like 1 million computers. And so it says, Joe, this account traded with this account, and then it verifies it with all these other accounts. And then it's like in the permanent record. And so as a result, you can't really hack it. Like as opposed to like at a bank, maybe they have like a dozen servers across the internet. You can hack all the servers at the same time and change.
Well, and this is a little bit of a measure, like if we're looking at it compared to currency, it's a way so that there won't be counterfeiting of currency.
You basically can't counterfeit it in that way. And it's unhackable in the sense that even if you were like, oh, I'm going to change the ledger on my computer, well, it wouldn't match all the other computers, so it wouldn't work. You'd have to hack like millions of computers all at once. So it's decentralized. This is a unique feature as opposed to most things are centralized.
Which is inherently more stable in nature, in natural system.
Yes. But the downside to that is that it is more computationally intensive, although they've gotten better at it. So, but then also like for finances, it makes it very fast and easy to make a transaction, and you can do it privately. You can do it with someone halfway across the world. You don't have to worry about the government nearly as much. So from that standpoint, there's some actual real value there. You can transact with people. And it's crazy. You can see the public transactions. And so people sometimes bring up these public transactions. There's like this transaction a couple of years ago that was like $300 million. What was that for? Like $300 million of Bitcoin transacted between people. Oh my God, what was that for? Anyway, so there's real value there. The way the blockchain works. And you can, and so that's why there's a bunch of other crypto coins that came out, because they're like, oh, this is cool. Let's use it. Let's do a little bit different. And so, are they going to take over Bitcoin? Maybe Bitcoin will go zero. I'm not saying it's going to be valuable forever. I'm saying that blockchain technology has value, and Bitcoin has contained its value pretty well. It's pretty much gone up. And then when it goes up and it goes back down, it doesn't go down to quite as low as it would go before. And if you hear, oh, well, I hear about these other people getting their Bitcoin stolen and hacked, it's because it's basically due to human error. Usually it's like they log in, there's like these accounts that you can log in to manage your Bitcoin, and those get hacked. or you have your information on like stored on like your phone and your phone gets hacked. That's how Bitcoin gets hacked. Nobody has had Bitcoin actually hacked in terms of they hack all the computers, and as a result, they're able to make it so that it seems like they have more Bitcoin than others. There's another important feature of Bitcoin, which is that they're effectively not making any more of it. The way it works is that it came out in big chunks. It was released in big chunks, and it was released in smaller and smaller chunks. And there's a little, I believe there's a little bit left to be released, but 99.9%, I believe, of all the Bitcoin out there has already been released and it's out there. And so, like, as opposed to with like the dollar and other currencies where they're constantly adding more cash to the system, that is not happening with Bitcoin. And that also helps with its value because it's a rare commodity. There's only so many Bitcoins out there.
Well, and so this is where we need to consider like what's value, right? And it's compared to something, right? It's relative. And we talk about like cash, like US dollars or whatever, as a fiat currency, what's called a fiat, F-I-A-T, I believe is the spelling. This is something that's not necessarily attached to a physical commodity, right? Or in Bitcoin, like Bitcoin, I don't think you would necessarily call it a fiat currency because it's actually connected and tied to at least a process or something that's tangible in a certain way, even though it's digitally tangible. And so, like, I think one of the reasons that the value may continue to rise, I think there's a strong likelihood that it will, is due to this driving force of that nearly every currency on the planet right now is fiat, right? It's not backed by gold, right? Right now, US dollars backed by the full faith and credit of the US government, which a lot of people are starting to, if they weren't starting to earlier, are now starting to maybe scratch their heads a little bit about like, where's all this money coming from, right? And this goes back to then understanding like there's no less stuff on the planet really than there was before. There's not really any more either, but there's a lot more of this currency. So what's going to happen? There's going to be devaluation. There's going to be inflation. And with something that's at least connected to or tied to in some way a more tangible thing like Bitcoin might be, it's going to tend to hold its value relative to other currencies much more strongly than things that are not.
And just the fact that there are websites and places that take Bitcoin, and the fact that it has I feel like it's past a certain threshold of ubiquitousness to where it's out there so much and you can actually exchange it for real things, and your ability to continue to exchange it for real things is the longer it goes, the more likely it is to be something that is long-term, relatively stable. Now it's still going to fluctuate a lot because there's a lot of speculation around it, but I think the chances of Bitcoin going to zero anytime soon is very low. I think that there is going to be some sort of crypto coin out there. And a lot of people are using this as a hedge against inflation. And so again, there's a value, actual real value there. People are buying Bitcoin because they think the dollar is going to go down or whatever currency is going to go down. So, and there are tons of other coins out there. But to me, what is really interesting is actually the technology behind it, the blockchain. I could see like the financial used as a financial instrument is really neat and obviously and probably one of the simplest applications, but I think that there's a lot of other future applications that we have yet to explore fully or figure out that go way beyond just a coin and financial stuff, because there's just some unique properties that you don't get with making software other ways, the classic way.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So like one of the points like with these kind of bubbles is also being able to identify like kind of like what I would call like a half-truth long-term trend. So like with the internet, I think the internet's a really great example because clearly there was value there. Clearly it was something that it was new and useful, but it became overblown. So it's kind of like its true value was kind of a half-truth. Like in the late 90s.
You're talking like the dot-com, what they call like the dot-com bubble and all that type of Silicon Valley type of
as opposed to like tulip bulbs where like maybe I wouldn't say they're valueless, but it's not like something really new and novel and incredibly valuable. The internet
has been tulips for a long time, I think.
Right. Like the value in its truest sense of a tulip bulb probably is roughly the same now as it was 200 years ago. Okay, so just like think about that, like that's maybe there's some slight difference, but the value of the internet is kind of like something from like didn't exist 40 years ago. It basically didn't exist. So really think about like, okay, is there real value here? That's kind of one of the ways that I look at, especially when it comes to financial instruments. Like a company like Tesla. I'm a big fan of Tesla, but not because I want the stock to go up or care about the stock that much or at all. It's more that I think they're creating real value. Their technology is much more advanced than in like 5 different ways than every other company on the planet, and they're creating something really cool. And there's real value there, and there's real people who want to buy it. So you can disagree with me on that, but the point is that look for real value, and if you think you can identify real value, then that's going to help you. But if you look at the bubble and you say, how much is a Beanie Baby really worth? Like, is there really value there? And you don't think there is, then don't pass up on it.
Yeah, there's I can't remember what the name of the documentary was, but it was like baseball cards, right? And I had actually, that was my very first business back in the 80s. I had a business, it's a baseball card shop, right? A sports card shop. But it kind of got into, these sports cards companies could limit the number of the amount of supply, could therefore drive up their prices. They could know what, like the Ken Griffey Jr. card. Like if anybody's around my age, the Upper Deck Ken Griffey Jr. Upper Deck, I think it was Upper Deck Update rookie card was like the first modern era card that was like worth $100. And you could buy pack after pack after pack after pack and just not get one. The only way you could guarantee getting one was buying a whole set. And then there was like rumors that they would just print off whole sheets of these things and then go to like these like live events and sell them off at, $80 a piece. And so this is one of these situations where it's kind of this artificial currency. It's like, what was the real value of that? The only real value of that was that there was a demand. And like in a weird way, like, okay, well, food is that way as well, right? The only reason that food has value is because there's a demand for food, right? But it's kind of, it gets down to then, okay, so what are humans currently believing they need? And that's why a lot of these trends are really driven by understanding how people behave and what people are paying attention to. And that's why they tend to be as erratic as they are. They tend to be driven by media as much as they are. It's one of the reasons why people like David and myself and a lot of other people we know tend to be able to generate revenue and income off of the internet. Because in one way of looking at it, what we're doing is being able to get in front of trends much more easily than people have been able to in the past. And there's something to continue to kind of flesh out there, right? We don't need to delve deep into it at the moment, but considering things like, sports cards, where it's a very artificial currency, so to speak, right? We can kind of look at almost all of these things as like currencies or we try to differentiate commodities and currencies, but there's not a lot of difference other than maybe a tangible physical, asset that's behind it. But it comes down to demand. It comes down to supply. Those are the things that drive price. And if you've got if you've got an asset and you can drive price through media, for instance,
yeah,
then you can vastly increase your wealth. And that's the nature of marketing.
There's a lot of bigger companies that buy media companies, and the media company is a loss leader. But
Red Bull, right? Red Bull's concept is they weren't a sports drink company. They wanted to be a media production company. And so they developed a sports drink to get them the ability to sponsor athletes in these extreme sports. And then their plan all along was to produce media, right? And so Red Bull's all over the place. The guy that jumped out of the high altitude thing, all the crazy extreme athletes doing double backflips on motorcycles and all that kind of thing. They looked at it from I think a more proper, more foundational perspective on, okay, so what's going to increase our wealth the most, and media was the driver for that. And in one way of looking at the internet, every website, every web page we publish is media.
Yeah, and like the trend that I identified was, I thought that, again, there was real value behind the ability to search the internet, the database of human knowledge. I thought that was so incredibly valuable. You just think about, like, trying to figure out what Kevin Bacon's birthday was in like the mid 80s. How did you even figure that out? Which is a really important thing to figure out. How old is Kevin Bacon? And now you can figure that out. Like, you can answer simple questions and even complex things very rapidly. And this is extremely
Well, you can get answers to them.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Whether they're
Not necessarily the
accurate
right
or not,
answers.
nah, you still got to be able to think for that.
That's true. But at least some data, you can get more data than you would normally be able to get with regards to certain topics. Quite rapidly, and a lot of times this is kind of a pro and a con of the internet. Information travels very quickly. Now, is it good or bad information? That's both of those can travel really rapidly on the internet. But the point is that the ability to search, I found to be kind of fundamentally valuable, and that I don't think will
fundamentally
go away.
different. Like,
yes.
it's a huge, like, what would search have meant in 1980? Like looking around your backyard, like looking on your own bookshelf,
looking through an Encyclopedia Britannica,
looking through encyclopedia.
Go to the index.
Card catalogs, Dewey Decimal System.
Yeah,
like these are, like, I grew up that way. Like there was a really, like, I feel that difference. I think a lot more than someone that's either older and doesn't understand the power of search, or younger that just always grew up with it. And assuming that, like, there was a transition that occurred for me. Like, even like Alta Vista and stuff like that. Like, for me, I was probably close to 30 before that became something that was even relatively useful for somebody who lived in a rural area. Like, there was just no way that the band, you couldn't, it took 45 seconds if you typed in 3 words for Alta Vista to come back with a page of results that might.
And the results were crap.
And they weren't that great, right?
Yeah.
But they were something. They were more than my encyclopedia set that Mom had bought our house in 1982.
Still faster than the encyclopedia
and
set.
Still faster, right? But they didn't have color pictures. If you wanted color pictures, those would take you 25 minutes.
What kind of pictures are we talking about here?
Well, no, we won't get into that. But I think everybody knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So, anyway, regardless, what this is driving at is that there was a foundational shift in value that occurred with search.
Yes.
And that is what's driving kind of the overall trend of, one of the things that's driving the overall trend of the utility of the internet. Search being a function that's just, I say, inherently valuable is something that many humans want and are now used to and are going to continue to want more of.
Well, this brings me to like COVID-19 and some kind of false trends that I'd say I identified, and some non-false trends that I think that are there. So if you are looking to get into the business of making and selling toilet paper because there's so much more demand for it, I think that would be a false trend. That's a short-term blip where people are reacting with fear, but ultimately we're not going to the bathroom more than we were before, right? So there's not more demand. Well, there, as we get more people on the planet, there's gradually more demand, but there's not any more demand than there normally would have been. It's a short-term thing, and there will actually end up being a period where there will be less demand. So I wouldn't be like, oh, I got to get into this business of toilet paper. On the other hand,
the toilet paper bubble of 2020.
That's right.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I looked at like there's a permanent change, I think, in how we work and how we socialize. Zoom, I saw their data. They said that the amount of Zoom meetings that they had from March to April increased by like 50%. And I mean,
it surprises me it's that little.
It would surprise me. Well, it went from like, I think 200 million meetings a day to 300 million. So it plus 100 million per day. So if you think about it, I guess that's times 30. 100 million, so it's like 30 billion. Yeah, it's like 30 billion extra Zoom meetings. If I'm doing my math right, 3 billion, 30 billion. Yeah, 30 billion. No, 3 billion. Yeah, 3 billion.
It's a big number.
It's a really big number.
Lots of zeros.
the point is that I think that this is also a fundamental change. I think it will swing back some to where people will do it less once we're all back out to doing things
Well,
more.
it's this thing like I mentioned with talking about search. People get a little used to it. It's like, wait a second here. Like it's kind of, I laughed at this morning when I was up walking around. We got the Cubicle Liberation podcast, and quite literally, we succeeded, David.
Yes, we did it.
We did it. Everybody.
Do not mention our Wuhan visits.
That's correct. We've liberated effectively probably 100 million people from cubicles, and I'm going to take credit for that personally.
You're welcome.
My amazing abilities of communicating value through the internet. So why not?
Well
right?
done,
Somebody's
sir.
going to take credit for it. I'm going to go ahead and take credit for that.
Take a bow. Take a bow. Well done, sir.
Yeah. But I don't even know where I was going with that because I got a little proud of myself.
No, that was really funny.
Thinking of it. But it's kind of interesting, right? It's kind of like, well, we have gotten used to a different way of working and realize that many of us have realized we can be quite effective, right? I'm speaking probably a little bit for other people as well, but I've been working quite a bit more than I normally did just because there's a lot more demand for online stuff because that's what people are doing right now. Whereas before they may have been transacting a lot more in person or having to go to a physical location or office, and they're realizing, wait, there's actually an efficiency here that we might be able to leverage and make use of and benefit from that. I think, like you said, it's going to really forever shape because people have gotten used to this to some degree and seen some value and benefit. Like you can't, you can't know whether you really want something unless you, like, if you really want to continue doing something until you experience it a little bit. It's like,
I think that there's going to be a lot of companies that were hesitant to let their employees work from home, and that they realize they like it or that it works just fine, and that they actually end up saving money. Of course, there's going to be companies that don't. Right. But how can you take advantage of this? Let's think about this. So, well, you could have invested in Zoom stock. I presume that there's a stock that you can invest in, but also like, so my child's like, say dance and karate and those stuff are doing online classes. So also like maybe investing in like webcam type stuff or video conferencing or, anything that is along those lines, I think is going to be, that's actually a long-term trend that I see continuing to some degree. There's going to be more demand for webcams. And I think that's a permanent change. It's just going to jump up and it's going to stay up to a significant degree. So it's not just a business standpoint, but also a personal standpoint. Like more people, like I socialized with like all my roommates in college. We had like a Zoom game night, and it was like some of them hadn't talked to each other in 20 years, right? Or something like that. Maybe more like
lots of zeros again.
Yeah, really a high number, a long time, more than a decade. And so, but it brought us together, and it was like, hey, this was fun. They were like, we really had fun. And we chatted well into the night. So it was really, we wouldn't have done that if it weren't for COVID-19. And now is this something that we're going to do regularly, even after COVID-19? I think there's going to be some people like that. I've heard of people getting drunk together on Zoom. And, that's not really my thing. But, if that's what your thing is, maybe that's what you do going forward for friends that are off living their own thing.
Hell, it might lower the number of drunk driving, issues. You just sit at home, drink with your friends, and then, you just go to sleep where you are. It's all good. Maybe there's going to be things that come out of this that are certainly positive. And I think, the ability to connect through technology, I think a lot more people are realizing how that can work, right? Because they've been forced to experience it to some degree.
Yeah.
Right. You've had to connect through social media or through, a webinar communication platform like Zoom or some other platform. And it's just something that a lot of people were like, well, why would I need to do that? Why would I need to be on social media? Why would I need to understand how to run a webinar or like I say, market a webinar? How would I go about getting people I know and care about to connect with me? I mean, that's kind of what marketing is. When you look at it, right? It's like, okay, we're just doing that and saying, oh, I want to know and care about like a whole bunch of people. And we can both benefit from that relationship. It's kind of marketing. So I think it's going to open a lot more people to like, oh, wait a second here. I know how to run a game night. Maybe I'm going to start doing this as a side gig professionally.
Yeah.
and seeing what I can do with it, you know?
All sorts of possibilities. Or I could see a business opportunity for helping traditionally brick and mortar businesses go online. So again, like the dance studio, they were never going to go online before this, but now they're doing online classes. They're getting used to it, but they had to figure out a lot of stuff, right? Maybe there's a service you can figure it out, and as you get used to it, you can, especially if you serve like a specific niche, like dance studios all across the country that are all trying to go virtual. You can go in and be like, hey, here's a product or service that you can get. And also a lot of these, there's a lot of money changing hands. You brought this up before. So like a lot of these people that are getting loans from the government, they have to spend it. And so could be part of the spending of it.
Yeah. Those, the PPP and whatnot, I think the loan forgiveness, a lot of it's based on spending. If they spend it on approved services or whatever, then it winds up being forgiven, which we won't get into the details on all that. But we could. My mind's wanting to take us really far down this deep look at money and economics, and I don't think it would be helpful. But
okay.
But what's slowed down are transactions, right? In the way that they were being handled before. But there's not really less stuff. Like, keep that in mind, right? And this is kind of just going back to right now, right? There's not really less stuff. Like, people don't know less, right? So they can still share their knowledge and experience. But there's been a recent shift that occurred that are letting people or forcing people to look at other ways of transacting and of doing business and of interacting with people. So that shift, like you mentioned, David, that's not something that then we forget about, right? And so this experience that we've gone through and we're going through still to a degree is going to be something that forever pushes the trend this direction. Right. So this isn't like, it was going like this, and is it going to kind of flatten out? But it's still going to be going this direction. It's still going to be inherently going. Right. Let me
Up.
break
Yeah.
my
For those
wrist.
of you
Up
listening,
and to the left or right. Yeah. For people listening, I'm
he's
karate chopping the air right now, trying to
karate
show the
chopping
slope
up.
of yeah. I don't know. I would have broken my fingers, I'm pretty sure, had I connected with one of those punches or slices. So regardless, like, this is really looking at, okay, so there's a trend, but it's being driven by an event, a thing that's not going to change, right? That we're not going to immediately just all forget about, oh, wait, my business is going well now, but if I don't have a way to operate, if the government decides to shut me down, I want to make sure I have that base covered, right? This is going to be in lots of business owners' memory and perspective. That's always going to continue to drive. Let's get more online, right? Let's open up that portion of our business. I think it's going to fundamentally change a lot of things, right? A lot of local businesses, martial arts studio may wind up being able to grow 10 times
Yep.
without buying 10 times more real estate or bring on 10 times more instructors, by being able to digitize or make their courses virtual in some way, and that's going to absolutely happen.
Yeah, no, there's going to be some people who realize, oh, wait, I can actually provide these. And instead of just serving the people in a plus minus 5 mile area, I can serve the whole country, the whole world with my lessons and charge and maybe have bigger class sizes and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Also, you mentioned before, there's the fear trends. Let's talk about fear and how it integrates with trends and just fear in general as well. You had a really good thing on that.
Well, I wish I could remember exactly what I said, but I'll try to stumble through. Jog my memory. I've got things I can talk about.
Yeah, there was a really nice way. If I like, fear is an emotional response, and basically, if your emotions are not something like curiosity or gratitude, this is directly from you, then it's generally not helpful.
Right. And so it was directly from me, but it was something that again, we cite David Mills quite often. But these aren't just quotes. Like, a lot of the things that I recall are things that I've foundationally understood, right? You've got to kind of take what you hear and not just parrot it.
Yes.
So to speak. You've got to really work through it to understand it. And if it's in fact true, now it's something you can know and something you can build on. And yeah, what you brought up with fear is that it's an emotion that should probably be a red flag for us. Like when we're, and I say a red flag meaning it should get our attention. When we're feeling fearful, what's going to wind up happening in our mind is that we're going to mostly be stuck. We're going to be very narrowly focused on like an event, an eventuality. There's nothing beyond it. It's just this horrible thing that we don't want to have happen. And if you look at what our mind can do, we are quite literally shutting down our ability to look at alternatives, to figure out a different course of action that could take us somewhere else, that can actually give us some power, that can actually let us function and not just kind of cower. And really that red flag that I talked about with fear, that red flag can exist anytime you're feeling emotions that are very far away from either curiosity or gratitude, right? Somebody's sitting there yelling at you with a bullhorn. If you get angry, if you get like shaky, if these things are happening to you, you got to kind of check that and be like, okay, so what's up here? Like even so what's the nature of that question? Curiosity. Okay, now I can automatically kind of redirect this super powerful thing that I've got going on here, mind-wise, and body too, right? Mind is inclusive of the brain, but your whole nervous system and sensory perception, all that, it's included, right? So if you notice yourself shaking, this is
mind, body,
this is mind, right? And so it's like being able to redirect that, which is kind of the main function of our consciousness, right? Being able to in some way shape or attenuate and attune our focus a little differently than it currently is, right? Into a series of questions. Just getting into questions gets you curious.
Yeah, and it what happens when you get afraid is that it activates the part of your brain that is the more primal part of the brain.
The less thinking part.
The less thinking, yeah. The higher functioning, the more intellectual, the smarter part of your brain is deactivated. But you can reactivate it by like questions like what Fletch said. So that is but it basically you make worse decisions when you're afraid. When you're in that emotional state, you make worse decisions.
Yeah.
And
is like getting into the trend of that right now. And obviously the kind of the COVID pandemic is what we're in the middle of. And I don't have an electron microscope. I'm not going to argue about what's this and that and what's causing this or that, or, what the actual numbers are. I don't know. But what I do know is that when you're afraid, you make worse decisions. And the general kind of sense of a lot of the media that I've encountered is such that it's going to make people afraid by and large. And that's something that we all need to be somewhat responsible for checking ourselves against, right?
Yeah.
Because what it's going to do, regardless of the truth of the facts of whatever it is, right? Which again, I don't know. And I would be willing to bet very few people actually do know the actual facts of how this whole thing is rolled out and what the actual numbers of this, that, or the other are.
Like pandemic specialist doctors, certain people that have the right amount of data. Maybe those are the people that know.
Yeah. Right. And even that, like it's a single person in a single facility. Right. And so you're still trusting other people to be reporting accurately and all that. And I'm not saying that happens or it doesn't. What I'm getting at is like, okay, I'm not that. Very few people are that.
Yeah. Right.
What I am aware of is that every person, even that doctor specifically, is going to be affected by fear. And if they get stuck in that fear, it's really going to shut us all down. And none of us are going to come out better for it. And so just, I'm not necessarily giving you some inoculation. So to speak,
he's not telling you to ignore the pandemic.
But just, but be aware of the fact that if you are feeling fearful, you're not going to be using the most powerful tool you have, which is asking questions.
Basically,
you're stuck.
And this is actually a fundamental conclusion of Benjamin Graham's book, which is basically when you're highly emotional, you make bad decisions. And this is the reason why most people fail at investing. And he talks about, I don't know if it comes from him, but it's sort of like a summarization of his thoughts. Be fearful when others are excited, and be excited when others are fearful. Now that's kind of a little bit of changing the different emotions, but it's more of actually an intellectual thing that when everyone is excited about tulip bulbs, wait a second, take a step back. And that's actually a good time to ask. It's not so much be fearful, but to really consider the situation.
Yeah.
Same is true for when the stock market has crashed. That's actually one of the best times to buy, but that's when very few people buy. And so everyone is afraid. Now you got to go, what are the opportunities here? So really, it's really about stepping outside your emotions and looking at the rational, the value-based. Is there value here? And if there is, then you do it. Then you go forward with it, or you do your best you can. You're not going to always be right. But you can limit the amount of times you're super wrong. Like if you were to jump on a trend that you invest heavily into a trend that actually wasn't there, that was more of a fad. Yeah.
That could be a dangerous move right now.
Yeah. Well, like, I guess fidget spinners. I don't know if that trend has gone away already. I don't really see as much of that, but like if you invested your whole life and business into fidget spinners, was it 2-3 years ago? I think the fad has passed. Am I wrong?
I think so. I don't know. I had to buy like 10 of them for my kids, and
you know what? I can
do for myself. But
why don't you talk on that? I'm going to look up some data actually.
Let's look up some data. We got the scientists looking up data.
I'm going to go to Google Trends and I'm going to type in fidget spinner.
All right. But yeah, but what you're kind of alluding to is the fact that some of these things are like we almost need a different word for it. I don't know what the word would be, but these are just little things like waves that come by and they go and they pass and they come by and they pass and they come by and they pass. So there's the wave and the trough, and with different items, this just happens over and over again. Cabbage, like I was watching the Michael Jordan documentary that's on ESPN right now. That's like the going for the sixth title or whatever, the last run or whatever it is.
The Last Dance. Yep.
The Last Dance. And there was a line that somebody in the media, it was on ESPN, I believe, was saying, Michael Jordan right now is as hot as a Cabbage Patch doll.
Oh, yeah, like, in the 80s. Yeah.
Well, like
his shoes.
Right. Comparing Jordan as if he was as popular as this hottest thing in the planet, which is Cabbage Patch, in which over time it's like people nowadays would be like, what in the F is Cabbage Patch?
Yeah.
But you still may know of Jordan and his name and the legacy that he had.
That's really funny.
Cabbage Patch, hot and then gone, right? So, Garbage Pail Kids cards, right? These are things that were just the biggest thing on the planet for a little period of time, and then they go away.
So I'm going to put a link to this in the show notes directly to this Google Trends search. But
you want to share screen and
yeah, I'll share the screen here.
On this? Yeah.
Let's see. Hold on one second. But basically, while I'm doing that, actually, yeah, I'll share the screen. Let's see. Here we go.
I could talk more about Cabbage Patch Kids or Garbage Pail Kids for that.
Here we go. Do you see that, Fletch?
I do. I think I see exactly what I expected to see.
I didn't expect it to be this strong, actually. So what we're looking at is Google Trends for fidget spinner search term over the last 5 years. Now, keep in mind that this is one data set, so it doesn't necessarily describe the whole of the picture, but it's such a strong result that I think it gives a pretty good indication. Basically, in spring, like April, May of 2017, it was at its highest peak. And right now, it is less than 1%. It gets less than 1% of the searches than it did in April, May of 2017.
Like, what's that? Like what you would call like the interquartile range there of the area under the graph. Like, how long did that last?
So it started to go up pretty rapidly at the beginning of March 2017. And then it started to fall right at like mid-May, but it was
2 months.
Went way down by August.
So over the course of 4 months, 5 months, give or take.
Yeah, March, April, May, June, July. Yeah, ish, maybe even August. 5 to 6 months, if you give it, and then after that, the whole rest of the existence,
flat.
Very, very little to nothing.
And yeah.
So let's say you were in. And we're looking at this right now, early April, and you're like, oh my God, these fidget spinners are so hot. and you're like, I'm going to invest my whole fortune, everything. I'm going to go for it so that I can make fidget spinners for the rest of my life. That would have been a false trend. Is there actual value there? I always kind of thought like, well, it's, but you also, an additional context here is that toys tend to be like this. It's very difficult, I think, to be in the toy industry because things tend to be really hot. Your target market for Cabbage Patch dolls grows up and they don't want them anymore. And so it becomes something that, the little kids want or that you wanted 2 years ago, like Frozen. Frozen. Let's see. I remember when it first came out. Let's look at how far. So it first came out, I guess it was 2000.
That probably shows the two peaks of the two movies.
Yep.
I would think.
Frozen release date.
Yep.
Let's see. Frozen was released November in 2013. And it kind of boiled. Like it got really hot. I had 2014, I had a 5-year-old girl.
I thought you were going to say you had a princess costume for yourself.
Well, shh, don't tell anybody about that.
We still have like light up wands from going to Disney on Ice for it. So
my daughter still has a doll that's of Elsa that if you sit on it or something, it sings the song. Every once in a while, it's like, where's that music coming from?
Yeah, now we're really talking out of our butts here. But
right.
Yeah.
So well done. Well played, sir. Well played.
I see. I brought it back around.
Yeah. Anyway, so, but this was a trend, but I mean, it was hot for a very long time, but you wouldn't want to have invested everything into.
Well, and what that shows is that was something that was very consciously taken on and marketed, right? There was no demand for Frozen before that. Why? Because it was something that really didn't exist. And so as a company, I believe it's Disney, right? So they took it on, they marketed, the media giant that is Disney, put the effort into promoting that. And they drove demand and, peaked it at around the time that the movie came out and all the merchandise and all that type of thing. And then it waned over time. And then it's like, well, let's go do that again. Right. So Frozen 2 comes out, several years later, and they were able to drive it again. And so that's such is the nature of trends that are consciously taken on and driven by advertising and media and marketing, right? Cabbage Patch dolls, right, so to speak, they didn't just necessarily happen. And I assume probably tulips didn't either. There was probably somebody that was pretty damn savvy and that had, a way to make money with tulip bulbs back then that started thinking about some things and figuring out some ways to, do some product placement, so to speak, or drive demand for this thing. And, some things happen randomly, but a lot of these are much more consciously taken on as an effort, as a marketing effort for a product or a service or something like that. So, even like driving, there's advertisements for road trips, there's advertisements for campgrounds, there's advertisements for Department of Transportation and all these kinds of things. Like we don't realize how many messages go into creating the desire, so to speak, for experience.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move along here. I want to talk about linear versus nonlinear. And this is something that is a real kind of pet passion of mine, in that like a lot of things, a lot of numerical trends appear to be linear, or we try to fit linear. And so linear means straight line, nonlinear means curvy. And actually I'll do this again. I'm going to share something that.
Now, Dave, is that true? Because a line can curve.
I mean,
what you're talking about is like a flat curve, right? A straight curve versus one that's going to be more parabolic, or
the
what they would call
mathematical
nonlinear.
definition for linear is basically straight line.
Yeah.
And nonlinear is anything
quadratic or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, anything that's not straight.
Okay.
And when we look at right now I'm showing, for those of you listening, I'm looking at the Dow Jones Industrial Average. I tried to go back further, but I didn't find it immediately, from 1985 to basically today. And I think a lot of people would try to fit like a trend line. You see this all the time, people putting trend lines. And sometimes that's accurate. Like even up here, they have like a trend line. But what's more accurate is, let me see if I'm going to find a longer term one. DJI. Let's see, DJI.
That's a drone company. GI.
It's like
All these acronyms.
1920 to today.
Yeah.
Graph.
Oh yeah. Pre.
I want to go
crash
way
depression.
back. Here
Yeah.
we go. Let's see. This goes back to 1916. Here we go. Let's share this. All right. The point here is, and this is actually not the graph that you would expect it to be. This is actually an man, this makes it more confusing. This is an exponential graph. So the amount of up and down distance changes. Actually, you can see a little bit of it down here, what it was be more like. If you look at like the graph of the stock market, let me just kind of make the point here. If you look at the graph of the stock market over the last 100 years, it basically looks like it's zero up until the last like 20 or 30 years. Let's see. This is a log scale. So if I take away the log scale, this is not accurate. There's something a little bit off about this.
It's inflation adjusted, David.
There we go. Okay, there we go. Well, the inflation adjustment is useful, so we can go back to that. But
yeah.
But this is basically like, this is what you look like. You'd think that we did nothing up until.
But that's what, like, with the inflation adjusted is like, oh, if you'd invested, $100 in IBM in 1970, today you'd have, $300 million. Well, what's not being accounted for a lot of times when people say that is inflation.
But what's interesting about this inflation adjusted, I hadn't looked at this before, is that this shows that there's real value here. If there's not real value being added to society, this would be flat. It'd go up and down, but it'd basically be a flat trend. All right, so here's my point, is that a lot of times there's over short periods, numerical trends or numerical patterns can appear to be straight lines. But that is very uncommon. I've studied like a lot, like if you study like physics or math, or the natural occurrences in the world, it's exceedingly rare that something stays a straight line. The stock market is an example of this. It's a long roundabout way. Linear versus nonlinear. So try to really think about things as being curvy, and not just women.
Well, you can think about those sometimes.
Yeah, that's true. It is very appropriate to think about those sometimes.
Yeah. It's like one of those, what do they call it? The Rorschach test or whatever.
Yeah.
The ink blots, like, what does this remind you of?
Women.
Yeah, women. What else do we have here that we brought into the notes? I think we kind of covered, like when emotions get involved and how much they shape our ability to think. Like one of the topics that kind of came up that we were mentioning, like climate change, right? There are a lot of people who are very, they get emotionally triggered, right, by issues, right? Or social justice, or like just things that they trigger an emotion. And once that emotion's triggered, it's very difficult to see things from a perspective different than where you are when you're in that emotion, when you're feeling that, when you're experiencing that emotion, right? And so I say a little bit, the data with climate change is probably in a lot of ways similar to COVID, whereas there are very few people who actually have firsthand experience with the data and how those instruments are calibrated and have actually run the science and the numbers themselves to know that from an experiential perspective.
I'd say it's more than COVID, but it's less than what people think. A lot of people speak like they understand it, and they don't.
Right. Same kind of. So it's the same kind of thing. Maybe not to the degree. But let's then move back. We can't necessarily build on something that we don't necessarily know ourselves. We have to build on what we do know. And what we do know is that when emotions become involved, we tend to make more irrational decisions, and we jump to conclusions more quickly and things of that nature, right? And so these are just things that like, okay, whether you see one side or the other, I don't want to look at it that way, because to me, it doesn't make that much sense. Like that, this is pitting people in a situation where they have to argue. If we can continue to build on, like, okay, well, when we covered this on the other webinar that we kind of ran like as a mock to this, like it's pretty easy to build on, like, okay, if you lived in a box and you couldn't leave the box, and your waste products, so to speak, from living just piled up in that box, you could realize that, hey, you're having an effect on your environment over
Yeah,
time, right? It's pretty reasonable to understand. So it's like, okay, well, it's reasonable to expect us to have an effect on our environment. To what degree that is, I don't know necessarily, with the
Yeah.
planet, right, and 7 billion people and a lot of things. But you start to see pictures of these huge masses of plastic in the oceans. Look at a photo of the Earth at nighttime, and you understand the amount of like light that's on nowadays. Kind of 24/7. These are things that's like, well, okay, yeah, that's different than it was 100 years ago, right? It's different than it was 200 years ago. What does that mean? I don't know. I don't know where that curve goes, right? There's the
Yeah.
whole 400 parts per million, like those are models. I'm not saying
Or
they're
show you
right or
something.
wrong,
Yeah.
but I don't know.
Yeah. Let's
But
look at something.
yeah,
Because I think that this is a trend, or at least it's a potential trend of CO2, and that's really where I think a lot of like the understanding of this is centered around. We can actually, you're like, well, how do we know what CO2 was 800,000 years ago? It's because there's basically air trapped in like ice in certain parts of the planet or certain other parts of the planet that we can test, and we know that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. And so when you dramatically increase CO2 levels, then which we are contributing to, now it's not just humans, but we are contributing to, it makes things warmer. There's a greenhouse gas effect. So this is why you see something like this straight up. So there's
and this is kind of the fun way I try to bring people's temperature down, so to speak, about the argument, which is like, this is a very selfish way of looking at things. Like what we're looking at here is like what we're doing is we're creating a lot more, a lot better environment for plants. They can breathe a lot better now than they used to be able to. Right. And but this is what it kind of points to, is like, we're looking at this from a very human perspective.
Of course.
In that it's like, well, if we want to continue growing at this relentless rate, we need to bring this in. I don't necessarily want to. And so, but what happens is there's just like this set standard and expectation that we should continue to be able to sustainably grow. That's ridiculous. We're in a fixed system. Yeah. At some point in time, there are some physical limits. Now, technology improves and all sorts of things change, but to expect for us to be able to support 20 billion people living as a reckless spending American does might not be reasonable.
Yeah.
So, there's just things to like, okay, well, let's just look at this. I like I said, I know the science probably better than a lot of people. It's one of the things I did study academically, but I also question a lot of it. Not the numbers of the science as much as the way it's portrayed, and what it makes a lot of us do, which is to either get fearful or get mad, or say it's somebody else's fault, or we all have to do something about this, when we ourselves don't change necessarily.
Right.
It's kind of
that's what I'm a big fan of science, because it's one of the few. It's an area of study that allows for questioning much more than I think a lot of other things would. Not that it doesn't have its share of times in which it like calls things ridiculous that ended up being true. But there's just a whole history of that, and lots of other. It's just kind of more of a human emotional response. And so, I do think that you can kind of identify a trend. I think that it points to a trend. Now, at some point, we'll run out of CO2 we can burn, run out of the stuff that we can burn. But a lot of people think there's this idea that I really think misses part of the point, which is like, oh, well, it changed before. It's just a natural thing. It's going to change. To me, it's more about the speed of the change. So the analogy I gave before was like, if you're driving a car at 80 miles an hour and you slow down over a quarter of a mile, that's not bad. But if you slow down over a few feet because you hit a brick wall or you rear-ended somebody who stopped, well, then that's bad, right? And so that, to me, I don't think about save the planet. The planet will be fine, and till a billion years from now when the sun burns out all the oceans. But I'm saying save humans. This is humans. The rate of change to me is a significant trend, and it's not good either way. So, and I think there's a lot of data behind it, in my opinion. That one's based. Now, I can't claim to completely understand it, but I have studied science to some degree. So the suddenness of change of the trend is significant.
Might be like those Cabbage Patch dolls, though. You don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. But even if it is a short-term trend, even if it does go back down, that's still not good. Going up and then down rapidly is not good for the sustainability of our society as a whole, at least in terms of, if you're worried about immigration, then you should be very worried about climate change, because there's a lot of like countries that are at like sea level that are no longer at sea level. They're below sea level. There's a lot of places. And so they're being displaced. Where are they going to go? They're going to go somewhere. I guess they could die. But so this brings up another point, which is about like kind of identifying short-term versus long-term. Like the Michael Jordan is a long-term trend, right? But also what was it? The fidget spinners was a very short-term trend by our definition, by my definition of short-term, right? So trying to identify what's short-term, what's long-term.
Well, yeah, and so like I don't know if we framed up or talked about like why is it important for us to understand trends, right? What about trends is it somehow good for us to know?
Make those dollar bills.
I mean, is that it?
No. Understand our world better. You can understanding not just like climate change type things, but there's all sorts of other trends that are out there. Understanding your personal interactions with other people. Is their behavior a trend?
Well, so this is a big one, right? So it's like, oh man, I've had some bad luck lately, right? It's a trend. It's going down, man.
Right.
Things are getting worse. Why? Well, because I made less money this month than I did the month before, and I made less money that month than I did the month before. So this is a downward trend.
Yeah,
it might not be the case at all, right? So it still gets to money, but it feels like it's like some like physics at work, where it's like this overpowerful force of nature that is pushing toward this thing, right? And that in a way, that's kind of fear as well, right? That's how it can feel. And so, from one way of looking at this, from my perspective, like really one of the things we need to guard against is I say guard against, be aware of and notice when it's happening, is when emotions become involved, or when we start attaching or triggering emotions based on what we're thinking about or what we're seeing or what we're feeling, considering at some point in time, right? And that's one of the reasons that we kind of brought up as we were talking about this, like, is it ever good? Is fear a good thing? Can it be a good thing? Is it always bad? Right? And my argument at the moment, and if I'm wrong, I'd like to know how or when, but it is always bad, right? And an emotion, so to speak, is what drives the brain into a little more primal place, where fight or flight are the only kind of things we consider, which then does not make use of our most powerful tool. So being aware of things, right? Being aware that the number of CO2 molecules in the atmosphere that we measure is higher now than it's been in any time we've measured it or been able to measure it. That awareness might be very good, but going to sleep every night, saying your prayers that CO2 levels come down, because that's the only thing you can do, is to just hope something changes. I don't think is necessarily helpful. I don't think in any time is fear something that is good.
Yeah, I think we should explore that maybe on another podcast.
Yeah, the difference between like fear or the awareness of danger. That's kind of maybe the way I would look at it.
The usefulness or lack thereof of certain emotions, because some emotions it's just part of the human experience.
Oh, we get into sociopaths, man. I can talk about those as well.
Yeah, that's true. I think we've covered a lot of topics, a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
I thought this was great. So
yeah, well, if nothing else, hitting like things like this, it can seem like trend it's just one thing, right? But as we kind of pull it apart and explore it a little bit more, there's a lot that goes into it. even knowing what it is or why it might be important, I think is something a little more complex than most people would have necessarily given, the concept at maybe first glance.
Cool. Well, thank you for listening, and you will hear us on the next Cubicle Liberation podcast.
Thanks, David. Talk soon.
Bye now.